Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lara Kroll, and I'm the Director of Policy Partnerships and Workforce Development here at the BC Care Providers Association. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, which is focused on recent changes to the union certification process here in BC. As today's webinar focuses on the union certification process, we are going to be tailoring today's session to non-unionized employers, though of course everyone is welcome to participate. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the territory. We are hosting this webinar on the ancestral and unceded territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples across British Columbia. I would like to thank them for being good caretakers of this land and allowing us to be visitors on this shared territory and to host this dialogue here today. If you'd like to introduce yourself and acknowledge your own territory, I would welcome you to do that using the chat function. In terms of housekeeping items, we are using Zoom webinar today, so you will notice as delegates that your video is turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, I do encourage you to do so by using the Q&A function, not to be confused with the chat function. And I'll direct the questions to our speaker at the end of the presentation. Please do also note that the session today is being recorded and that we will make that video available to participants after the event. So please behave yourself accordingly. And of course, we'll also make the slide deck available as a PDF. So on that note, I'm pleased to introduce Danny Bernstein. Danny is a partner at Roper Braille, where he provides strategic and timely advice to clients on labor, employment, and human rights issues that arise in the workplace, which of course is what makes him the perfect person to facilitate this session today. And I will just say that Danny's been very generous with his time over the past couple of years and has hosted several education sessions for us. So a big thank you to Danny. So without further ado, Danny, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lara. Thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome. Happy afternoon. I'm going to have to just make some changes on the fly now, Lara, because you told us to all behave ourselves. So a few slides may need to be edited along the way. We'll see how we go. Now, everyone, we're talking today about some changes recently to BC's Labour Relations Code, particularly affecting non-union working environments that are under threat or pressure of unionization. So let's get into it. Firstly, an agenda for the day. We're going to look just at the code at a glance. For those who are overly familiar, it will be very high level. For those who are not familiar, it'll give you a bit of an introduction to the code. Then focus most of our attention on some changes, particularly around the certification process, which has been a hot topic lately. I'll get into some slides on what you can and can't do, what to look for, how to deal with an organizing campaign, which is when you have a union in the process of getting membership support to organize your workplace. We'll talk about unfair labor practices, which deals with some provisions under the code that prohibit certain behaviors and the risks of engaging in those behaviors, and lastly, some hopefully practical advice, tips and tricks that you can take home for if you have to deal with these scenarios. Please do feel free to ask questions as we go. If I can address it at the time, I will. If not, we'll definitely have time for Q&A at the end. All right, so overview of the Labour Code. Generally speaking, it is the statute that creates the legal regime for all of labour relations in the province. It only applies to provincial employers, so federal employers, airlines, banks, telecommunications, not covered by the BC code. Some of the main parts of the code is it sets out a regime and a structure for collective bargaining. It sets out a structure for creation of bargaining rights, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today. So how a union becomes the bargaining agent at a workplace, at an employer. It creates protections around the desire to unionize. it sets out what an unfair labor practice is, which predominantly is prohibitions on employer behavior. It does go both ways. Unions can also be found to have engaged in unfair labor practices, but mostly what the board deals with would be complaints against employers. And the last bullet point there, we include just to make the point that the code is designed to promote unionization. It is not designed to protect employers from becoming unionized. The whole labor relations regime exists as a protection of the right to unionize and the protection of union rights once they are granted. So we quite often get clients who are new to this, who are either becoming or have become unionized, and they say to us, well, where's my rights? What about me as an employer? Where are my protections? They are there, but that's not the purpose of the code. And it's important to always keep that in mind when you're dealing with any issues with unions. So the NDP government, as we know, have been in power 2 terms now, and more recently won a significant majority, so have had their way, so to speak, with a lot of changes around the employment and labor relations. A couple of significant changes that have impacted labor relations in BC are in 2020, the government extended the period that union cards are valid up to 6 months. And what that means is if I'm an employee, a non-unionized workplace, and I sign a union card, that card is valid for 6 months, which means unless I revoke it, the union can do what they want with my card, as in can use that to a membership, to a certification at their choice. They don't have to come back to me and say, okay, we're applying for certification now. They don't need my consent. And it's now 6 months, whereas it was 90 days. So the window for employers to be under the auspices of an organizing campaign is much longer now. It's now 6 months. And that has implications for employer behavior, which we'll get to later in time. So that was the first significant change. And then most notably now in June, after a lot of discussion, what's called Bill 10 was introduced. It made amendments, several to the labor code, some to the construction industry. Most, for today's purposes, what we're focusing on is what's called card check certifications. So what does card check certifications mean? This is the name of the recent amendment, just for everyone's reference there. So what is it? What did it do? Prior to Bill 10, we had a secret ballot model for certification. So if a union wanted to certify a workplace, they needed to have cards signed. They presented those cards to the labor board. If they met a certain threshold in terms of percentage of the proposed bargaining unit, the board would order a secret ballot. And that ballot had to take place within 5 days of the application from the union. And so that gave a small window of time for an employer to communicate with their employees, to understand that there was a campaign underway, provide information to the board, dispute the bargaining unit, etc. Now, what's happened is there is still the provision for a secret ballot, but it is a lower threshold for a union now. And what they need is a number of cards signed will automatically result in certification. There is no secret ballot anymore if the union has over 55% of the cards signed. So if they have at least 45% of cards signed, that's the minimum threshold. And this is the previous process. They had to have 45%. Then the board would order a vote. It was a secret ballot, and the simple majority of those who voted in favor would get the application across the line. Now, with card-only certification, we have two processes. We have, firstly, if the union has 55% of employees in the unit have signed cards, and remember that can be, excuse me, at any time within the 6 months prior to the application. So they can have been organizing your workforce for 6 months, you've probably been unaware of it. At a certain point, they feel they have enough cards signed, at least 55% of whom they say is in the unit. So if there's 10 employees, they need 6. And if they have those cards, the board will certify the union without a vote. If the union has between 45 and 55%, then the board will order a secret ballot. So the 45 is the sort of the base threshold. A union won't get past step 1 without at least 45% of cards signed. But if they have now 55% or more, so as I said, in the example of 10, 6 out of 10 people have signed a card, then the board can certify the union without a vote. That's the significant change that we've seen. Interestingly, just a little bit of history. BC had card-based certification for many years. We then went away from card-based certification again for probably a decade or more, and now we're back to card-based certification. So it's not new. It's also something that is used in other provinces and federally. So card-based certification isn't unique to BC, but it is a new change that we've seen. So the card check model, what does it mean? What does it look like? The union needs to submit cards which have been signed, union membership cards signed and dated and within 6 months. And the board has a number of criteria. In fact, there's a regulation in place from the board that describes what a union card must be. It has to contain certain information. An employee has to be clearly indicating that they wish to become a member of the union. The signature has to be valid. It has to be dated. So without that, the board will reject the card and send it back to the union and say this is not sufficient. If the union doesn't have 55%, there's still a secret ballot. And the way that process works now, it's all being done. It has been for the last few years during the pandemic online. I don't imagine the board's going to move away from that. So if there's a vote, the board will arrange for a vote. The employer will have to communicate to its employees that there is a vote. A notice of vote gets posted at the workplace. And then 5 days later, there's probably a 24-hour window in most cases where employees can go online and vote. And again, it's the majority of employees who vote at the time. It's not related to the number of people in the workplace. So if you have 50 people in your workforce and 10 vote and 8 of those vote in favor, then you will still be certified, even though ultimately it's only 8 of the 50 employees. So there's a lot of encouragement from employers to have employees vote their say at that time.
Danny, just before you go forward, do you mind defining the board for folks on the call?
Sorry. So the board, yeah, good question. The board is a labor relations board. It is the main tribunal that is in place, set up by the Labor Relations Code to deal with any issues arising out of the labor code. So the board is the tribunal that awards certification, that deals with complaints around unionization. It can appoint arbitrators to deal with grievances. It consists of a chair, several vice chairs, a registrar. It has many officers who do sort of the investigative work. I think they're called returning officers, but I think we're going to move away from that lingo now, according to the board. I can't remember what they will be called. Maybe they're all just going to be officers. So when you are dealing with the board, you're most likely dealing with, either through counsel or yourself directly as an employer, with an officer of the board who's going to be collecting information, asking questions. Thanks, Lara. Sorry, I should have covered that at the outset. Okay. Any other questions that I should address now, or should we move on?
There was one question that came forward, actually two, that maybe we could address right now. So from Jeremiah asks, is there any protection for employees who do not want to unionize?
Minimal. If you are in a workplace that is becoming unionized and you vote no, but the majority of employees vote yes, or now if 55% or more have signed a card, then your workplace becomes unionized, and you can resign if you don't want to work in a unionized workplace. Now you can, as an employee, you can say your piece. You can put your view forward that and advocate against unionization. Employers, management, supervisors they do not have the same freedoms or flexibilities as an employee does, and we're going to get to that. An employee can't be coerced or forced into signing a card. If they sign a card by accident, they have an ability to revoke their cards. We'll talk a bit about the board's audit process later, and that will cover that off. But generally, if you're in a workplace that's unionizing, you can't opt out. And there's another question there. If an employee who signed a card has since left, so that becomes a question of who is entitled either to vote or who makes up the bargaining unit, and it will depend when they've left. If they leave much later in time after the application is dealt with, it will be irrelevant. If they leave immediately after and before a vote has happened or before the board has certified, the employer may have an argument, excuse me, that they are not appropriately in the bargaining unit. The employer may want to do that, they may not, because it may depend on the numbers. A lot of this from employer perspective is a numbers game. How many people do you think are appropriately in the bargaining unit? Is it more strategically advantageous for you to have a bigger bargaining unit because there's less likely that the union has sufficient support? So there's a lot of strategy that goes into that considerations, and you've got to move pretty quickly because you've only got a short time. So hopefully I've answered those questions, all right?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay. We will carry on. Good questions, by the way. Thanks. So the new certification process. What we've heard from the board in writing and at a meeting of the board and the Labor Bar last week, and LRB is Labor Relations Board on the slide. They've said that what they're going to do with this new process is conduct frequent and random audits of new applications, and that is effective immediately. So what does an audit look like? The board has fairly broad powers. When they get an application, particularly with card, if the union is saying they have sufficient cards for no vote to be required, then the board has broad ability to inspect payroll records. They are indicating that they might email or call employees directly to say, did you sign a card? Do you intend to unionize? If the board has any suspicion around signatures, they can ask the employer for records to confirm matching signatures. If the employer is not being cooperative, the board officer has the ability to attend at an employer's business and conduct an inspection. They can demand records, and they have, much like WorkSafe, much like employment standards, they have a statutory authority to receive records and not be interfered with. So, I mean, really, if you're dealing with a board officer, it's in your interests to be cooperative, to provide the records, to answer the questions that they want. But I think the key for me is from an employer perspective, is the board is telling us they will call employees on a random basis and confirm that cards were signed. And to me, that presents an opportunity for employers to communicate with their employees. And we're going to get into this communication and the limited scope that you have. But I can see a communication coming from an employer to the workforce to say, you may be contacted by the board, you may be emailed, you may be called. It isn't spam, because most people now, if they got a, if labor relations board came up on their phone, they probably would think it was a scam of some sort. So tell them to be aware of it, and so that they can genuinely tell the board if they did or did not sign a card. And really, the board is just, that process is to keep everyone honest, and to avoid any fraudulent activity with signing and sending in cards that people either haven't signed or didn't intend to. So that's the random audit. The board has said it will be ongoing, effective immediately. I haven't seen any yet. We haven't, in fact, I haven't, and I'm not aware of any new applications under the card check model, but they will be there. It'll be interesting to see how often and how frequent the board does these audits. I suspect initially it will be quite frequent, because I think the board will be very minded to make sure that the process goes smoothly, build confidence in the process, particularly on the employer side, so that it gets underway on good footing. Just on this point, something that's been sort of in my mind is, I know a lot of my clients, when they're under a unionized, a certification campaign or an organizing campaign, when it gets to the point of an application, the board will ask you for contact information for your employees. And if you are, I mean, I guess in this sector, it's not a guarantee that all of your employees have work email addresses. You may only have personal email addresses, in which case, if they're not up to date or not valid, or if you don't have any, then you cannot give that information to the board, and then the board can't contact those employees. So if you're in an organizing campaign, or at the point where you've got an application, it will be really important to make sure you have up-to-date contact information, cell phone numbers and email addresses, if you don't have a work email for your employees. And that's a delicate balance, because not every employee wants you to have their private email address. So that is something you would probably speak with HR or your legal counsel at the time about how to get that information. But you don't want to be caught at a point where you feel like your employees may not have signed cards, or may want to speak to the board, and the board can't communicate with them, because the board won't give you indefinite time. They'll reach out to your employees, they'll email them, they'll call them, but they won't wait and wait and wait, because this has to happen quickly. A vote has to happen within 5 days, or certification has to happen within a short time. So you won't have forever to be gathering that information. So something that we've heard some concerns about is, I'm an employer, a union is organizing my workplace, they have 55% or more. Am I just going to hear from the board that I'm unionized without being able to have any say in it? Luckily, that isn't the case. As an employer, even if a union says to the board, we have 55% of cards or more, you, the employer, will still get a notification of a new application before the union gets certified. And this is because the board gives the employer the ability to have some input. The union has to describe the bargaining unit, and it might be all employees except management and office staff working from this address. But it might also be only a specific category of employees, or healthcare aides, all administrative staff, all whomever it is. And it may not be appropriate. You may say, well, we can't carve out this group because it's part of a bigger group, or whatever the case. So you, the employer, will have the ability to say to the board, before being certified, this is not an appropriate bargaining unit. You can take any issue with cards if you have knowledge. Maybe you've got an employee saying, I never signed a card and I see my name. You just don't know. So you'll have an opportunity to have input. There'll be an investigation through a board officer, and there can be a hearing with the board where each side, the union, the employer, will get to put forward their evidence to say, hey, here is why we say it's not an appropriate bargaining unit. Here is why we say there's people on the list that shouldn't be on the list, either for voting or for cards. And the board won't determine the application until it hears from the employer. So that should give you some comfort that you will still have input. That being said, you will have to do it quick. So if you get an application, you really don't have time to sit and think about it. Speak with your HR, speak with counsel, but you need to move very, very quickly to be in a position to be telling the board any issues. Okay, we're on to a sort of a new topic here. I just want to check in, Lara, are there questions before I get into this?
There is a question, but I'm actually going to save it to the end for now.
Okay, so let's move on then. When this is about obligations during certification. And there's two parts to a certification. There's an organizing campaign, and there's once an actual application is filed. So an organizing campaign is when a union is actively trying to organize your workforce. And because cards can last for 6 months now, this can go on for quite some time. The Labor Code, Labor Relations Code at Section 6, sets out some restrictions. I won't read the language, but it basically puts some prohibitions on what an employer can and can't do during an organizing campaign. What you can do is run business as usual. So you continue to operate your business. Any plans that you have already in place that are already sort of crystallized can continue. So even if that means you had already planned layoffs or purchasing a new business or shifting into a different industry or whatever that might be, if it's business as usual, then that can continue. Now, you may, more than likely, you'll get a challenge from the union if it's drastic. They may say it's that you know, that's a reaction to the organizing campaign, but as long as you can prove these were plans that were in place that were crystallized and are not at all impacted by the campaign, then you'll be okay. You can still discipline, you can still dismiss employees, but be very conscious of having strong grounds for doing that, following proper process, having paperwork to back it up. Because if you dismiss someone who happens to be a key union organizer at your workplace and you don't know it, you're going to be in for a fight with the union at the labor board. They're going to allege that it's an unfair labor practice and that you were trying to scare the bargaining unit away from voting or from signing cards or whatever the case. So make sure it's well documented. Make sure you've followed proper process and have good valid grounds. What the code says very broadly is employers cannot interfere with the formation of a union. So very broad restrictions. You can't actively try and prevent the union from organizing, but there are caveats to what a union can do too, and we'll get to that in terms of the scope of what a union can actually do. So it's not they don't have free reign. For example, they can't just come onto your business and interfere with your workplace. But you do have to be very careful that what your actions are not seen as interfering with the formation of a union. So what is an organizing drive? It is a drive to form a union within a workplace. And there's a slide later on, what does that look like? But know that it is in place until the union files an application. There's no set period of time where that defines an organizing drive. If the union is actively trying to organize you, whether or not they have enough cards, whether or not they file an application, you should assume that you're under an organizing drive and that you're governed by the rules in the labor code. Now, when the union files its application, they are no longer under an organizing drive because that they've achieved the purpose of the drive, which is to file an application. And then there's a new set of rules that layers onto what I've just said in terms of what you can do. So when an application is pending, as in it has been filed, employers cannot change terms and conditions of employment. That means you can't change wage rates, schedules, job positions, job titles, promotions, demotions. It's only a short period of time, but it is a strict rule under the code. You cannot terminate, discipline, suspend without what's called proper cause. It's not just cause as you know it, sort of at the common law and employment standards, but you can't simply decide we don't need this position anymore, we don't like this person anymore, as you can when you don't have a union in place. So you need proper cause, and I've fought this fight at the Labour Board before on employers who are under an application or an organising drive and dismissed employees or disciplined employees, and then they have to defend them that they had proper cause. So probably a good time to get into what is an unfair labour practice. I've mentioned this before. So the code prohibits any conduct that undermines the rights that it grants. Employee free choice, ability to join a union. And as I said before, an unfair labour practice can be committed by employers and by unions. So there are times where we, on behalf of our clients, might go to the board and say, a union has engaged in an unfair labour practice. In the context of organising and certifications, it's almost always allegations that employers have interfered with the right to form a union or have dismissed or disciplined without proper cause, which would be an unfair labour practice by the employer. So the main reason you should be concerned about this, apart from you don't want to have to spend time and money at the Labour Board, is if an employer engages in an unfair labour practice during an organising campaign, during when a certification application is pending, the board can actually automatically certify without a vote, without counting cards, because it can get to a point where the board will say the employer's conduct has intimidated or tainted so much of this workforce that we don't have confidence, we the board don't have confidence that this bargaining unit will actually, that these employees will actually vote their true wishes anymore. They're scared by the employer, so they're going to vote no, or they have lost confidence. So it's not always, but it is this automatic certification is possible, and that is the worst case scenario, because then as an employer you have no ability to defeat the organizing drive. Okay, I want to talk about what you can and can't say. This is very much tied into the unfair labour practice prohibition. So the Labour Code at Section 8 says, nothing in this code deprives a person, in that case a person being an employer or a union or an individual, the freedom to communicate to an employee a statement of fact or opinion reasonably held with respect to the employer's business. So, few key criteria here. It firstly has to be a statement of fact or opinion. It has to be reasonably held, and it has to be with respect to the employer's business. And that last piece is key. So business means it can include in relation to collective bargaining. It does not include the employer's opinions about unions, about being union members, about the idea of unionization. It doesn't include negative comments, for example, about what will happen if we join a union. Certainly doesn't give any scope for threats. If we join a union, we're going to close. We can't afford to keep you. Friday fun day is going to go. No more free dress on whatever day, whatever, there's hundreds or thousands of examples at the board of employers saying things that have been found to be unfair labor practices. So has to be a statement of fact, has to be or opinion reasonably held, and the board will test reasonably held. So for example, a business owner can say, well, this is a statement of fact and it's my opinion, but if it's so unreasonable, then the board will test that, and it might be found not to come with this in this language. So this is intended to allow employees the ability to provide information to their employees, to respond to an organizing campaign, but it isn't free speech. It certainly isn't this broad-reaching ability to say what you want or think about unions. And that's even more apparent because I'm going to show you now. Keep in mind, this is current language. This is the previous language that again was changed very recently under the code. So Section 8 used to say a person has the freedom to express his or her views on any matter, including matters relating to an employer, a trade union, or the representation of employees by a trade union. So you can see that that language was really much broader than it is now. So when you contrast the two pieces of language, you can see how much more restrictive it is intended to currently be. Lara, I'll check in any questions that I can address now, or should we carry on?
Yeah, there was one that came forward, and it's calling back a bit now, but one person put a question in. You were referencing an inappropriate bargaining unit. They were just looking for an example of what an inappropriate bargaining unit might look like.
Okay, so an easy example, and I've got a case on this at the board right now, is where you've got a number of employees, all who sort of perform similar duties, and the union comes in and says, we want to organize only one part of that, or we're going to draw some boundary around, we're going to divide the employees in half, and we just want this half. And maybe that's because they've only got cards signed by that half. Maybe the union feels like there's some distinction between them, but that wouldn't be appropriate, because then you would have employees working side by side, some union, some non-union, under the doing the same work for the same employer at the same workplace. So that would be an easy example of an inappropriate bargaining unit. Maybe the union would try and might include different categories of employees. They might try and include admin and professional staff, or who knows, different categories that do different work altogether. And you might say it's not appropriate to have everyone within one unit because they're very different, work under different terms and conditions, different wage rates, different management, different rules, different regulatory bodies. So that would also be an inappropriate bargaining unit. But just on this point, the board isn't interested in what is the most appropriate. It just has to be an appropriate bargaining unit. So you could come to the board and say, look, the union wants bargaining unit A, but it would be much better if it was bargaining unit B. And the board won't be interested in that. You would have to say A is not at all appropriate. So hopefully that answers that question.
I think it does. Have you ever seen a situation where the employer has actually gone to the union and said, look, you're proposing A, but I would like to propose B?
Yep, that happens, because the union can always withdraw and refile. So it's possible. Look, the union works on limited information. The employer has all the information, and the union relies on its inside organizers and whatever external sources it can find, or publicly available information. So it's possible that an employer could go to a union after an application and say, look, you've got it wrong. We don't work at that address, or this is, you've defined this wrong. We don't have these categories of employees. More likely that an employer is going to use that to go to the board and say, this is not appropriate. But it's possible, if the circumstances are right, that a union would withdraw and refile. And I've had situations where a union has tried 3 times. They've filed, withdrawn, filed, withdrawn, filed, withdrawn, because they keep trying to get the definition right.
Okay, thank you. And I'll hold the other question for now.
Okay. Okay, so how do you know as an employer if an organizing drive is underway? And the simple answer is it's hard, and maybe you won't know. It is really about having solid, open communications between frontline managers or supervisors and staff, being attentive to issues, and therefore being able to hear and listen and pick up on things. But a union will try and keep it secret. That a union doesn't want you to know as management that there's a drive underway, because the longer they can get cards signed, the longer they can communicate with your employees without any interference, the better for them. So they're going to try and keep it secret until they can apply to the board. And then that invokes the additional protections that we've talked about once a certification application is underway. Or if with card-based certification, they're going to wait till they have enough cards signed and they can apply without a vote. And we will talk about just to get to why organizing campaigns might start, or what will drive a campaign. So clues of a drive, this is something to watch for. Are you seeing leaflets around? Are there union organizing cards? Sometimes your staff will come to you and say, hey, the HEU was out the front giving me these cards, or the BCNU, or whoever it is, HSA, here, there's someone giving out cards out the front. So you may get an obvious sign. You may find them in the copy room. You may find them in the bin, in people's lockers. I'm not saying to go search those places, but you may find signs around. You may find that there's groups of employees who are closely talking, and then as soon as a manager walks by, everyone scatters, or they stop talking. If your employees are asking for employee lists, schedules that they have no real reason to need, contact details, those are signs that perhaps a union is trying to get that information. If there are rumors of upcoming changes at the workplace, that always scares employees. What's going to happen? Are we going to lose our jobs? Are we being contracted out? Are our wages going down? Are we getting laid off? That is easy fodder for a union to come in and say, we'll protect you, or for an employee to go to a union and say, we need protection. So if you have that situation at your workplace, then be proactively aware that that could lead to someone contacting a union. Other red flags, if you learn about organizing committees within the workplace, or recruitment of volunteers, different meetings that are happening, campaign literature, these are all just things that you should be aware of, that you should watch for. Question that comes up for us quite often is, do employees have to provide organizers with information? And the answer is no. The union and the union's organizers, and your employees, if they're organizers, have no rights to that information. The code doesn't allow them that information. So if, for example, a union organizer came to you and said, look, we're organizing and we need you to provide us with schedules or contact information or employee lists. Firstly, that's private information that you're not allowed to give them. But more importantly, they have no right to that. If you believe you're under an organizing campaign, it is a good exercise to go through your own IT access and figure out if there are people who have access to that information who shouldn't. Because if you've got someone who's a union organizer and they can access your schedules and your employee lists and your contacts, they may well be feeding that information to the union. So it's a good idea to, I think, generally to always keep close tabs and limits on who can access payroll, scheduling, that kind of information. Once a certification application is filed with the board, then you have to provide that information if requested by the board. Okay, we're going to get into some do's and don'ts now. As I've said, some protections are triggered during an organizing campaign, some are triggered when an application is filed. But when a campaign is underway, as I've said, is vague. It's not always obvious to you. And even if you don't know that it's underway, you can still commit an unfair labor practice. So even if the employer is totally unaware, the proper cause standard still applies, for example, and you can still inadvertently commit an unfair labor practice. So don't guess, contact HR or really be aware of the situation. So what you can do, important. My experience is that employers who are unfamiliar with unions and labor relations often think unions have more power than they actually do. So unions cannot organize during working hours. They cannot come into your workplace. They cannot insist on meeting with employees during working hours or inside the workplace. If an organizer is there, you can tell them to leave. You can tell union reps to mind their own business and wait outside. If inside organizers are allowing that to happen or attempting to unionize and organize during working hours, you can discipline them for that, and you can certainly prohibit that. If it's on their own time, lunch breaks, after work, before work, weekends, as an employer, that you cannot protect or prohibit. You can talk to your employees and tell them that they cannot be compelled to talk to or join a union. Some employees I've heard have felt like they had no choice. And unions are businesses, and they're good at what they do, and what they do is organize. So they will have compelling tactics for organizing, getting cards signed, having people become supportive. So you can, to a limited extent, push back against that. And you can tell your employees that unions can't coerce them or intimidate them. And you can advise employees about the process for certification. So that's just providing information set out in the labor code. If you're aware that an organizing campaign is underway, you can conduct meetings. We've got non-coercive here. What that means is that people can choose to come and go. You are allowed to have what's called closed door meetings or compulsory meetings. We don't suggest you do, because they will get scrutinized a lot more where you're forcing attendance. But if you have a meeting that people can join or not, where you're sharing information about the business, about the certification process, about what we've just said, unions not being able to coerce you to sign cards, threaten and intimidate, then that is fine. And this last bullet here is what I mentioned before. You can tell employees that they might be contacted by the board if you're at that point of a process, and stress to them the importance of participating in the process and speaking with the board. Because in my experience, the more employees that you can get involved and voting or speaking, generally the better the outcome for you. It's those employees who are neutral, for example, and they might vote against, but they're not overly active. You need to communicate to them that it impacts them too. Going back to the question of what rights does an employee have who doesn't support a union, they have to speak up. They have to make their thoughts known, because if they do nothing, they're still going to get unionized, even if they disagree with it. Okay, some examples here of what are reasonably held beliefs. We talked about this before. What can you say? You can talk about working conditions, and you can compare it with what you know to be unionized and non-union competitors, for example. You can point to existing collective agreements and make the point that our benefits are better, our wages are better, whatever it might be. You can talk about flexibility, and that when you're in a unionized workplace, there's no guarantee that you have the same flexibility. Flexibility in working arrangements, in scheduling, in time of work. Those sorts of things aren't guaranteed with a union. You can talk about your business, how it fits in the marketplace, competitive advantages that you have, risks. What you can't do, and I think we'll get to this next, but I'll mention it now, you can't make threats. You can't say, if we unionize, we're going to go out of business. We can't afford a union. We can't afford this. We're going to have to close. We're going to have to cut hours. People are going to get laid off. All of that would be threats that would interfere with the formation of a union, and those would be unfair labor practices. The last bullet here is an important one as well. We quite often have companies asking us, look, the union is making all of these statements about us and they're not accurate, they're not correct. What can we do? So you can correct any defamatory or incorrect, untrue statements. So where a union says the company is planning to lay you all off, or the company is going to, the company wants to close down and contract out, or whatever the union is saying, if it's wrong, you can correct it. And that can be very powerful for you, because then your employees may lose trust in the information they're getting from the union. Some examples of what you cannot say, and then we've covered this quite a bit. Don't threaten closure, don't threaten changes, location, hours of work, etc. Basically, don't make threats. That's a pretty good blanket rule. Don't favor some ahead of others. Don't knowingly discipline union activists or union supporters. The last point there, don't suggest they start a petition. We put it there because it happened. So it may seem silly, but we've seen it all. Never ask whether employees are members of the union or signed a card. It's not your information, and don't get someone else to do it for you. Don't ask, try and get information. What's happening? What's the union saying? What are they doing? Definitely no watching surreptitious recording of union meetings if you're aware that they're taking place. If they're during working hours, shut it down. If it's in a time where they're allowed to, it's not your business. Don't surveil them. You might have employees who are your insiders. That's possible. You might have employees who don't want to be unionized, who come to management and say, here's what I'm hearing. And that's okay. You don't have to tell them to not tell you that, but it has to come from them. It has to be voluntary. You can't seek out that information. And even then, you do have to be careful. Okay, we've got to the end. We've got a few minutes left. I'll open it for questions. Lara, there's some summaries here, but I think people have the main points there. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, a couple of good questions have come in. One about unionization more holistically. This person asked, what triggers workplaces unionizing? Do employees come up with the idea of unionizing among themselves, or are they more likely to be approached by union reps?
Yeah, okay, good question. Really good question. It's a number of factors, and I think it can be both that unions approach workplaces or employees go to unions. Quite often, it will be the latter, where, as I talked about, if employees are scared, if they're not confident, or if they're worried about their working conditions, they're hearing rumors of change, new management, we're getting bought out, there's a transaction, we're going to get contracted out, we're going to lose our work, that will drive employees to go to a union. But unions are proactive at the same time, and particularly in healthcare, and particularly with an NDP government, we've seen a lot of proactive activity from unions in certain sectors where they are going after workplaces, and they will come to your workplace, they will find someone, they will start communicating, and they will start organizing, they will get that up and running independently, even if things are going well. So as management, if that's why I say it's really key that your frontline managers have open ears and open eyes and open communication channels. If your employees feel that they can talk to you, they can bring grievances forward and they're going to get dealt with. If they've got complaints about hours or overtime or harassment or anything that they can be addressed and that you're going to listen, then that can help prevent a union getting a hook in. If people are being terminated or laid off, or if things aren't going well, then that is an impetus for unions who come in and say, we'll protect you, we can stop this from happening. So key is so important to have good communication channels at that front line of management. and an ability to act and resolve issues as soon as they come up.
That is likely just very good advice in general for the
Yeah, be a
management
good
of your
employer,
workforce.
basically.
Yeah. And another question that came in, and I think this is from the perspective of a home health employer. So in an organizing drive, how do they, the union, find out the contact information of employees, especially for workers who are on the front line and do not gather at a central office?
Yeah, with difficulty. And this is why 6-month cards makes it easier for unions to organize. You may have one insider who, that's why I was saying, who has access to your payroll records and your scheduling and your staff list, because people will share this information, even if they're not supposed to. So they might get it from an employee. They might get it through social media, through word of mouth. They'll spend time slowly trying to figure out who the people are, and they'll use any means that they have available to them. So if your employees are dispersed, it is harder for a union to get that information, and it may take them longer, and it is easier for you to defend against an organizing campaign, as opposed to you've got people who clock in and clock out at the same place at the same time, and a union just needs to wait outside and they'll get everyone.
I imagine that the advent of social media has made that process a little bit easier, because you can track people online. And
they form chat groups, WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, organizing groups all the time.
Another question, and I think this goes back to something you were talking about before, Danny, is why do unions have 6 months to gather signatures while employees have 5 days to respond? I think it might be employer have 5 days to respond to certification.
Because the code is designed to promote unionization. That's the underlying premise. The 5 days actually used to be 10 days, and it was recently, within the past few years, was reduced to 5. There's a lot of noise from the labor movement saying that 10 days was too long and employers could interfere, and that the more time there was, the more time an employer had to commit unfair labor practices which prevented unionization. That was one of the main reasons, at least stated publicly, for moving to card-based certification, was it avoided employer interference. Now, I think the reality is that the statistics don't bear that out. They don't bear out that there's so much employer interference that it's preventing unionizing, but that was one of the stated reasons. Interestingly, just as a complete side note, in order to decertify, even if there's 55% of the bargaining unit signed up, it's still a vote. There's no card-based decertification. So didn't quite cut both ways.
So essentially what you're saying to me, or saying to us, is that the process is designed to be tilted to one side by design, really.
By design, it's not a secret. The code is designed to protect the rights that it grants, and it grants the rights to becoming unionized and then bargaining and having protections of a union.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A function. I'll give folks 30 more seconds to get something in. One of the questions that I had, Danny, because I went searching for this and wasn't really able to find something, is I was trying to see if there was any resources, and I'll call them sort of independent, resources that couldn't be impeached, let's say, that just provided information about the union certification process. I was thinking that employers would want to have something that they can say, look, this is provided by the Labor Relations Board, this is factual, anything out there that you can think of.
The Labor Board has recently updated its website, and it does have a lot of good information. I think it's just www.lrb or bclrb.com. I could be wrong. So it has a lot of good resources. It has a guide to the Labor Relations Code. It also has sort of drop-down menus. I'm an employer and I have questions about organizing or applications. You can call the board and ask, and they will provide you information. There's a website. You said unimpeachable, so I don't know how close this gets, but there's a website called Labor Watch, which provides some pretty, perhaps not neutral, but employer-friendly sources of information. So the board, I would say, would be your first point of call if you have questions. And there's a guide to the Labor Relations Code, which sort of breaks down each section and gives some commentary about how it applies and how it works in real life.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Okay,
There's a
one last question.
Yeah, I can see that here. How are employees notified? I think the board is moving away from fax and they're going to they use email communication now. So we normally just get an email from the board. And I do think, yeah, before it was only by fax, and you'd get multiple faxes because everyone had to be copied on everything. And if there's lots of unions, then lots of copies of the same fax. But I think they use email mostly now.
And the one last question is, do organizations like WorkSafe BC or SafeCare BC promote unionization? And I think I can answer that question being no, they're neutral in that.
They're unionized as employers. At least I know WorkSafe BC is a unionized employer, but I don't think they promote unionizing.
Okay, so I'm noting that we're over time. Thank you so much, Danny, for being so generous, coming to present here today and providing those insights. I think they were very helpful. I know that I found them really interesting. If folks on the call here today have further questions, want to get in contact with you or your colleagues at Roper Braille, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I've got my email up there on my phone. Feel free. I'm happy to chat if you have follow-up questions or need some more information. They can reach out through you, Lara, or me directly. Absolutely happy to chat.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, we will be sending around this presentation as a PDF. You can see that includes Danny's contact information. I really encourage you to touch base with Roper Braille for your law needs as it relates to these areas. They've been an incredible resource over the years. And with that, I'll say thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks, Lara.
Bye now.